Motherboards, the main board, sometimes called a main board. It has the CPU on it. Here we have a picture of a motherboard. This is not the newest motherboard. We're going to talk about some newer things going forward. Now you've got the motherboard socket connector. And when we look at something like the newer Pentiums, they use what's called a LAN grid array instead of a pin grid array. That's an old pin grid array socket. You got the back panel connectors that are usually built onto the motherboard nowadays. You're not going to see an AGP connector any longer. AGP died the day PCI Express came out. PCI Express is so much faster and so much lower cost that everyone abandoned it. So it's kind of a history item. Still can fall on the exam though, but it's getting slim. PCI slots, PCI is still on motherboards, but they're getting fewer and fewer. Actually, cards are getting fewer and fewer. The only card I've added to a computer in the last few years has been video cards, and that's usually into the PCI Express. And you got the BIOS. The BIOS with the CMOS keeps the contents of your setup. What drives you have, if you have a floppy, you probably don't have one now. I think I still have one floppy, but it's a USB. How much memory you have, what date it is, that's all kept in there. You've got connectors for your CD, IDE drives, SATA drives. SATA's not on this slide, but smaller connector. It'll come up later. SATA's become popular. We got our chipset, our North Bridge and South Bridge. South Bridge controls the low-speed components. The North Bridge controls the high-speed components. And our high-speed components are really fast. A lot of data being pushed through them, so much that the North Bridge now tends to have a heat sink and sometimes a fan. I think on this board you see a heat sink on the North Bridge. It's gotten much more impressive on newer boards. We got a power supply connector, and it's still ATX. We may have an auxiliary power supply connector, another 4 or 6 pin connector to provide additional power. And then we've got our memory, which are going to be DIMM slots. And we're going to look at those in more detail later. So on our motherboard, components we have the CPU. Be it AMD, be it Intel, be it another company. Now, we're looking at desktop motherboards here, so it's pretty much is just those two. We look at other devices, we're going to see ARM processors, Cortex A8s from ARM. We're going to see some Cyrix things. But for desktops, we've got it down to pretty much 2. We've got expansion slots, mostly PCI, some PCI Express, and they come in different speeds. You may have AGP. AGP is not considered a slot, but considered a port. A little fine detail there, but it's considered a port. Make sure I know that for the exam. It's one of those little minor things that likes to pop up. You got hard drive interface connectors. Could be IDE. It could be SATA. SATA's more common now. Floppy drive interface connector, you might have that on your motherboard. Still a pretty good chance of it. Odds are you don't have a floppy drive, but you still have the connector on the board. Optical drive interface connector could be IDE. More common now, it's going to be SATA. Might have a connection to go to the audio in of the motherboard. You can have a power connector. That's going to be ATX. Okay. 20, 24 pin ATX. Older ones are 20 pin, newer ones 24, and some of them have an additional 4 pin connector on the board as well. You're going to have memory slots. This is going to be for DDR, DDR2, DDR3 memory. Most modern systems are using DDR3. The exam may go as far back as DDR, but that's going back quite a bit now. That's pretty much limited. We're going to see other memory mentioned, but they're pretty much too old for the exam. PS2 mouse and keyboard ports. You may have that. This is that small round DIN port with 5, 6 pins. Most of us have replaced the PS2 mouse and keyboard ports. We're not using them. We're using USB mice and keyboard or wireless with a USB connector. We got USB ports. Mostly it's USB 2.0. Newer systems are going to have USB 3.0. Most of probably 4, 6 connections with probably 2 of them being USB 3 and the rest being USB 2.0. You may have a FireWire port, also known as Sony iLink or IEEE 1394. IEEE 1394 is the generic name for it. You may have a serial port, 9 or 25 pin serial port. Yeah, I don't think so, not if it's made in the last decade. It's the rare system that does. Parallel port, kind of the same deal. We used to connect printers by parallel port. Very few computers have them nowadays. Desktop might still have it, odds are against it. You got a CMOS battery, complementary metal oxide semiconductor battery. The CMOS is where your settings for the computer are stored, and the battery keeps those settings active. The battery should go dead, it's going to forget your settings and you have to go into the BIOS and reset things. And it's going to forget them promptly again unless you replace the CMOS battery. Luckily, that's usually just a large watch battery, something like a CR 2025 or 2032. Those are the two most common. In the old days, we used to have literally battery packs and similar, which were a nightmare. That's gone. Real simple, large watch battery now. You have a network card built in. That's very common. Some systems have more than one, but most of them have only one. And it's going to be 10, 100, maybe gigabit as well. Very common to see gigabit. You may have video built in. Very common on a lot of motherboards. Now, higher end motherboards tend not to have the video built in, but mid-level and lower end ones do. You may be thinking, wait a minute, I pay more for a motherboard and they skip the video? Yeah, they do. Because at the high end, you're more likely to want to pick a specific video card, so it's not included. Maybe you like ATI. Maybe you like NVIDIA. Maybe you have a reason for one over the other. You need a higher speed one. And that's why you tend not to see video on the high-end motherboards, but you do see them on mid-level and low-end. You're going to have fan connectors, fan for the CPU, chassis fans to keep the case cool. And you can have up to 4 chassis fans. You can have a CPU fan. You may have other fans in there, secondary CPU fan. I have seen that. Jumpers, literally 2 or 3 pins and you put a cap on them. Jumpers used to be common. They're not so common any longer. Most motherboards don't have them any longer. The only jumper you're likely to have is a BIOS jumper to clear the CMOS settings. You move the jumper over to the other setting. You know, it's a 2-pin jumper on a 3-pin connector. You move it over to the other 2 pins, it clears the CMOS. You move it back, it retains the CMOS. A daughter board. This is an auxiliary card, a peripheral card. It's its own circuit board, connects to another circuit board to provide or assist with its functions, most often used with video cards. Daughter board just means a peripheral card or additional card, helper card.